Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second event that we have in cooperation with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the University of Groningen. My name is Francesco Giumelli. I'm Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Groningen, and I coordinated together with Pim Gelkgoed at the Illicit Trade Group here at the University of Groningen. A little over a year ago, we started these yearly events in cooperation with GI, and we wanted to create a platform to discuss and advertise a little bit of a few of the themes that both GI and us are working together. And today we have a great pleasure to have two highly distinguished speakers. We're very happy to have them on board today. Let me present to you Ambassador Zvekić. He's a permanent representative at the Office of the European Public Law Organization, and he has an incredible experience in many organizations. I was thinking how to introduce you, Ambassador, but the list of organizations will be too long. So I can only say that your career in the international organizations is impressive, and at the same time you're also senior advisor with GI Talk. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. And then we also have Laura Adal. Laura Adal is the head of Western Asia program at the Global Initiative, and also she is the project leader of the Global Organized Crime Index that we are going to be presenting today as this joint event. After the presentation of the index, we're going to have Pim Gelkgoed, the associate professor in criminal law here at the University of Groningen, offering a couple of comments, and then we're going to have a discussion on the work. I would say that I want to thank, just to start with, Globalization Studies Groningen, which is also an association that we work with, and it's an institute that allowed and is organizing the event today. So thank you, GSG, for organizing this. Without further ado, I would then move on to the presentation. So I will give the floor to Mr. Ambassador. Please, the floor is yours. We have 15 minutes, more or less, a bit more, and then we're going to go to Laura and then Pim. Mr. Ambassador, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Professor, very much for the introduction. We are, of course, very pleased to have this second opportunity of joint discussion about topics that are of interest to both of our organizations. And I think that is very important for the things that we are doing, also to exchange views and experiences, but also expectations. So let me start shortly more with the, if you like, policy and methodological background of the index, while Laura will present more details about the index itself. We all know that today there are many global indices in the world. Many things are being measured through some sort of indicators, and they end up as an index or indices. And that is, I think, also the result of the globalization and the need to have a sort of a shortcut, if you like, to a very complex phenomena. And therefore, if you look in any of these global indices, you will see that they are a sort of shortcut. But there, of course, shortcuts can be of better and worse quality. We are convinced that the Global Organized Crime Index, at least this first edition that we have, which is still not even the whole year, but about that old, has a good quality and really has a potential to be further developed. It emerged because of the realization, I think, common knowledge that there was no systemic measure of organized crime in the world. And that also has to do with the appreciation of what are possible strategies to deal with organized crime. Much of the debate around organized crime was based on some of the appreciations of the trends and phenomena in the northern part of our hemisphere rather than in the south and east. So we also, as for many other phenomena, had a little bit geographically and, if you even like, geopolitically biased picture of what is happening. So there was a need to balance the view, and also because organized crime today is very much transnational, and therefore it needs this more comprehensive approach. I also would like to point out that there was also, in a number of measures of organized crime or knowledge about organized crime, only the criminal side of it was looked at. But the response size of that was somehow marginalized. And I think that one of the advantages of this particular index over a number of other global indices is that it looks both at the morphology of the phenomenon, that is the organized crime, as well as to the phenomenology of responses to organized crime. And that is, if you like, conceptual and methodological balance that we tried to achieve with this construction, which is called Organized Crime Index, and Laura will talk more about that. And finally, a number of non-state actors were somehow out of picture when one talks about organized crime, and particularly when one talks about the responses to organized crime. So this is, of course, since it's in its childhood, the index is just the first step, a stepping stone to build on for future activities. Laura, next slide, please. So I already mentioned what are the main purposes of this index. We believe very much that any illicit phenomena and response to illicit phenomena cannot be properly understood without a dialogue and discussion from various points of views. And this index is sort of a starting point for a dialogue about organized crime and responses to organized crime. It will also provide certain information for policy making and also certain information on the response side, and that is where should be the priorities, because the situation is not exactly the same in each of the jurisdictions that we are looking at. It is also very important to fully appreciate and express the relationship between organized crime, strictly speaking, and a number of other phenomena that are really related to organized crime, either as a condition for organized crime, facilitators, or as the consequence of the organized crime activities. It should also help in measuring the results. One of the big problems that we are facing today is that we really don't have sufficiently good apprehension of the impact of a variety of measures against organized crime. This also includes the impact of, for example, United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime. There was no study of the impact except on the normative level. And therefore, the index, particularly the response side of the index, is trying to provide some fundamentals for measuring the results, which of course was lacking. It is, from the academic point of view and research point of view, providing evidence-based research and analysis. What we hope is that this index will be able to predict trends. But for that we of course need series of data and series of indices. Otherwise it would be very difficult to talk about trends. At the present we still have not sufficiently, I would say, developed its predictive capacity. But it has to come with further development of the index itself, methodologically and conceptually, and I'll come to these points, as well as in terms of timelines of the index itself. Laura, please, the next slide. So what is it, from whom it is? Well, it is for everyone, but of course, you know, there are different audiences that might be interested in that, academia being obviously one, policy makers, civil society, but even citizens themselves. These index, and we are quite proud of that, has received quite a good feedback in terms of interest shown in it. And therefore, since the launch, it has featured in many articles across the variety of media outlets, including very well-known media fora like Forbes, CNN, Washington Post, etc., etc. On monthly basis, we also have measured that website users from nearly every country in the world are increasing, and that is a very important thing. So it is not only North Hemisphere product, and it's not only used by North Hemisphere people. For example, only last month alone, the website has been visited by almost 14,000 users, and actually that's the highest since the launch. So we hope that as we go on, the number of users will increase. We have also been engaged, and the interest has been shown by a number of important international and regional organizations, such as Interpol, and stakeholders, including countries like United Kingdom, Australia, but also non-state actors, which are part of the index, actually, civil society, and a number of business enterprises and communities. So we did want to have this wider use and reading of the index, and it appears that we are on a good track with it. Laura, the next one, please. Of course, as any index, and I started my presentation with saying that there are a number of global indices or even national indices today, it has limitations, and we have to recognize these limitations. It is not perfect. We still have to work on that. So it is flawed with a number of things, but it is worthwhile exercise to undertake, particularly because it's pioneer in this sort of measuring organized crime. It has, of course, limitations because it is limited by the category of organized crime actors that we are looking at, as well as by the category of markets, illicit markets, so there we come also with illicit trade. And these were, of course, made by the choice, which was not, it was a choice dictated by the availability of information. It was very difficult to include markets for which we don't have good coverage, geographically speaking, good coverage. So some of the markets have been left out, such as economic or cybercrime, or for that sense, we don't have a category called illicit trade. So it would be interesting with you to discuss how can a category called illicit trade being captured by organized crime index. That we have not really done. We have done parts of illicit trade as separate markets. but not the concept of illicit trade as such is not within our categorical apparatus. So I think this is a discussion and maybe the work that we can do together. There are also information gaps because not each of the countries that we have covered has the same amount nor the same quality of information. So there are always certain gaps in the sort of information. And then also information is time-bound. And in some countries we have more updated information than for other countries we have very old information. So even in terms of timeliness, not all of the information that we are using is of the same time period, which of course this all puts certain limits to our index, and I think you can appreciate that we are very open about these limitations. Of course, we also had a limitation of COVID-19 as the rest of the world, because it was first of all difficult to gather some information at that time, nor we had some information that was affected by COVID itself. One of the biases that we have is in the methodology. This is a very famous now word, hybrid, no? Like we have hybrid cars and we have hybrid conferences online and in presence. Well, we here also have a hybrid data set or database, if you like. A lot of from secondary information, but also from expert appreciations of the situation. And obviously, whenever one has human touch into data, there is a certain level of arbitrariness present. It's very difficult to control this level of arbitrariness. That is the normal, I think, outcome of this sort of methodology, though we have tried by employing very strict methodology in terms of cross-checking experts' appreciation of the phenomena and responses to organized crime to make sure that there is not too much deviation. But that remains to be one of the biases that we have, and obviously we are very keen to make sure that the quality and reliability of that sort of information coming from the expert opinion is guaranteed even more in the future. And the last slide, Laura, please. What is the further use of index? Well, what we have now with your university is for academia. We think that for teaching courses on organized crime and related phenomena and for research purposes, this is a very good basis also for exploring the linkages between organized crime and other social issues. So obviously, in the research and academic community, there is, we believe, a lot of use of such an index at the national, regional, comparative level, as well as on the global level. In public policy, as we said, we have tried from promoting discussion. Well, this is really meant to promote discussion on the specific conditions of particular country, organized crime groups, and markets in specific environment. And international milieu, this is to promote this strategic, comprehensive approach, and also to promote an ability for a faster adjustment of the normative and policy responses to the emerging challenges, and an adequacy of concentrated international response and civil society partnership. This is for us very much important, and that is where the predictability of index comes into play. Because predicting emerging forms of organized crime, as well as emerging possible reactions or responses, resilience as we call it, to organized crime, is probably the strongest element for proper academic and public policy utility of organized crime index. And finally, I would just like to say, because we have now very much unbalanced and very difficult geopolitical situation, particularly in Europe due to the war on Ukraine, and that is, how can an index take into account geopolitical changes and their impact on the national, regional, and global organized crime configuration? It is also changing in these conditions, and maybe we have also to look at the potentials and limits of an organized crime index to capture such changes as well. I would like to thank you for your attention, and these were more or less introductory observations on the organized crime index. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Zvekić. This was a very, very interesting presentation. I mean, this is only a confirmation of why we wanted to have this index being presented. We found this extremely interesting, and the work done is very useful as well. I can speak, of course, for the academics or as a first person, but this is an impressive work, and we are very happy to have this discussion. But I will now pass the floor to Laura for further information on the index. Laura, it's a pleasure. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. As has been mentioned, I will be walking you through the Global Organized Crime Index structure and methodology, followed by an overview of the index results. And then I'll speak briefly a bit on where we're headed for the publication of the next iteration of the tool in 2023. All right, so to begin with the structure, the index not only measures organized crime and related issues, but also assesses countries' resilience to organized crime, recognizing that criminality and resilience are interrelated, and that the value of this tool is really enhanced when we're looking at both sets of dynamics. And so you see here on this slide, criminality is depicted by a, quote, criminality pyramid, while resilience is shown by a resilience wall. And so the tool captures criminality by evaluating two components. First, the scope and scale of 10 criminal markets, which you see make up that tail or the base of the pyramid. And second, 4 criminal actor types, which make up the height of the pyramid. And so the wider and higher the pyramid, the higher a country's criminality score would be. At the same time, in assessing resilience, the index evaluates the existence and effectiveness of 12 what we call building blocks of resilience. And so again, you see here, the higher the wall, the higher the resilience score, and vice versa. All right, now turning to the criminality component specifically, as I mentioned, criminality is broken up into 2 components. And so here, first looking at that criminal markets component, the index covers 10 criminal markets that are outlined here. Now, each of these markets is a standalone indicator, but we can generally group them into 4 broad categories. And so first we have the people-based markets. So this would cover human trafficking and human smuggling. We have the trade markets, in this case, arms trafficking. We have 3 environmental crime markets and 4 drug markets. Now, for the criminal actors component, what we've done is come up with 4 different criminal actor typologies, recognizing, of course, that not all criminal groups will always fall neatly into one category or another. And so first, we look at mafia-style groups. So these are groups that usually have a known leader, they're structured, they typically control territory. And here we would include groups, of course, like the traditional mafia groups, but also drug cartels, militias, and terrorist groups if they regularly engage in organized crime to fund their activities. Next, the index looks at criminal networks. So these are looser, less hierarchical entrepreneur-type actors. Third, state-embedded actors. So these are actors that are embedded in and acting from within the state apparatus. And then finally, fourth, foreign criminal actors, which really is a catch-all category, including both state and non-state groups who are simply operating outside of their home country. Turning now to resilience. So under the index I mentioned, there are 12 underlying resilience indicators, which you see are listed here. As with the criminality indicators, each resilience building block is a standalone and equally weighted indicator. But again, it is possible to group them into 4 broad categories that reflect the different parts of society. And so here we're looking at things like leadership and governance, criminal justice and security, economic and financial issues, and of course, civil society and social protections. And so when taken as a whole, these 12 indicators really have that potential to provide holistic and sustainable responses to organized crime. All right, so just a little bit on the methodology. So as an expert-led assessment, for each of the 193 UN member states that the index covers, 2 scores are assigned. First, countries are led by their criminality score, combining markets and actors. And second, countries are assigned their resilience score. Now, all indicators under the index are scored on a scale of 1 to 10 based on the scoring thresholds that you see there on the left. So for the criminality component, a score of 1 represents the best possible scenario, where the illicit market or actor type doesn't exist. And a score of 10 represents the worst possible scenario, where the illicit market or actor type has an extremely negative influence on all parts of society and or state structures. Now, when determining the criminal market scores, experts are asked to consider both the monetary impact of the market, but also that non-monetary impact. And so here we're looking at things like geographic concentration of the market, how many people are involved in or affected by the market, how much violence is involved, the scarcity of the commodity, and so on. Similarly, when determining the criminal actor scores, experts are asked to consider the organizational capacity and the level of sophistication of the various actor types, as well as their overall influence on the state and society more broadly. Now, by contrast, for the 12 resilience indicators, that 1 to 10 scale is flipped. So a score of 1 represents the worst possible scenario. In other words, the resilience measure or framework doesn't exist. And a score of 10 represents the best possible scenario, where the measure exists and is extremely effective. Now, for the resilience indicators, experts are asked to assess essentially 2 key elements. First, does the resilience measure or framework exist? And second, is the measure effective in combating the organized crime conditions in that country? So, for example, we would not penalize a country for not having, let's say, a wildlife trafficking law if wildlife crimes are not a major issue there. Now, one qualifier I'd like to note is that it's not enough that a resilience measure exists and is effective. In this sense, we also look to how the resilience measure is being implemented and whether or not it meets international human rights standards. Another important note on scoring for both criminality and resilience is because of the way that the index is structured, countries that have more diverse, let's say, criminal markets, for example, will have higher scores than countries that may have just 1 or 2 extremely pervasive market or actor. And this is just because of how the index calculates scores by taking a simple average of all the indicators to come up with a final overall score. Speaking of scoring, the actual scoring process was an iterative process, which you can see on the diagram on the left. We carried out initial research to create a preliminary profile for every country in the world, highlighting background information for each of the 26 criminality and resilience indicators. These profiles were then reviewed, amended, and scored anonymously and independently through a series of thematic and expert geographic reviews. And then input from those rounds were consolidated, and profiles then went through another series of evaluations, including consultations with our regional observatories, just to make sure that the scores were calibrated for regional and then eventually global comparisons. And so in the end, over 5,000 indicators were scored and reviewed, with the entire process relying on over 350 experts worldwide, just to underscore how much of a collective effort it took to develop a product that was comprehensive, accurate, and truly global. All right, so with that, I'll move on to the actual results. So one of the main index findings is that nearly 80% of the world's population live in conditions where criminality is pervasive and resilience is not sufficient. And we often like to use this vulnerability matrix to show this. And so you see here on the slide, the x-axis on top represents criminality, the y is resilience. They form 4 quadrants, where a score of 5.5 is the midway point. And so starting with that bottom left beige quadrant, this is where countries with low criminality and low resilience would be placed. And you can actually see here that the majority of countries in the world, 77 of them, fall into this category. Now, right next to it in red are where countries that are in the most serious situation are placed. And we have here 57 countries that have high criminality but low resilience. And so when you take these two bottom quadrants together, we see that sort of grayish corridor covering both, showing that overall 79.4% of the global population live in countries with low resilience. Now, moving up to that top left green quadrant, this is where countries ideally would want to be. And so we see here that 50 countries fall into this low criminality but high resilience category. And then finally, in that top right small peach-colored quadrant, only 9 countries in the world fall into this high criminality but also high resilience category. And so when you take this quadrant along with that bottom red one, we see another sort of pinkish corridor covering both, showing that overall 79.2% of the global population live in these countries with high criminality. All right, here is just a zoomed in representation of that low criminality, high resilience block in that top left corner of the vulnerability matrix. And I thought I'd just show this briefly just because the Netherlands actually falls into this quadrant. And you can see it there circled in red, very close to countries like Japan, Sweden, Ireland, and South Korea. Now, even though countries in this quadrant are in the quote ideal situation, of course they each face different vulnerabilities to organized crime, but have nevertheless developed effective resilience frameworks to address the conditions that they face. And so for these countries, they really can serve as examples in their respective regions for engagement and also for lessons of best practices, so that more countries really have the chance to move over into this quadrant. I want to say generally, when you're looking at the vulnerability matrix more broadly, what is interesting to see is how close countries are to the borders, especially those that are really right on the cusp of moving over into another quadrant. And so you see on this slide here, we see countries like Rwanda, Costa Rica, and Romania on the bottom that have been circled. That are right on the edge of moving into that low criminality, low resilience category. And so it will be interesting to see over time how and where countries move across the matrix. All right, so zooming back out to some of the more macro level results, another key finding of the index is that with a global criminality average of 4.87 out of 10, when you break that down by continent, Asia exhibits the highest criminality overall across the 5 continents, followed closely by Africa and the Americas, with Europe and Oceania exhibiting lower levels of criminality. Now, that might be a little bit expected that Asia tops the list because the continent is just so vast. Just the sheer diversity of the different criminal activities that take place there, either as source, transit, destination, or a combination thereof, may be what's driving up that score. Moving on to resilience. So with a global resilience average of 4.82, Europe by far exhibits the highest levels of resilience, followed by Oceania and the Americas, with Asia and Africa displaying resilience levels below that global average. Another way to look at the results is by thematic area. And so here we have a criminality breakdown by market, where we see a global criminal markets average at a 4.65 out of 10, with human trafficking identified as the most pervasive criminal market worldwide, followed by the cannabis trade, arms trafficking, human smuggling, and so on. And when we look at these and we start to compare the most and the least pervasive criminal markets, we can start to see some patterns that really speak to the availability and the versatility of the different commodities. So for example, let's look at human trafficking. Not only is it human beings that are unfortunately the subjects of exploitation, but the fact that that exploitation itself comes in so many different forms. So we're talking labor trafficking, organ trafficking, sex trafficking, and so on. And so because this market encompasses just a range of illicit activities, it really can occur in any and every country in the world, regardless of its size or wealth. On the other end of that spectrum, we see flora crimes with the lowest prevalence globally, and this could also speak to to issues of availability and versatility. So the use of flora commodities, may be comparatively limited, and for flora species, really like all other environmental commodities, the fact is that the larger the market becomes, the less commodities there are to exploit. All right, so I've mentioned that criminal markets only make up one aspect of the index criminality scores. And so by exploring the dynamics of criminal actors, the index gives us some insight into how criminality is perpetrated. So for example, even though criminal networks can generally be thought of as the conduits of illicit flows within a country and transnationally, in fact, it was state-embedded actors that were identified as the dominant criminal actor type worldwide, with a global average of 5.76 out of 10. Now, this was followed by criminal networks and then foreign criminal actors, and with mafia-style groups at the bottom end of that list. Now, to the right of the slide, you can just see the score distribution for all of the countries in the world. So, for example, looking at mafia-style groups, you see this large circle here showing that 43 countries in the world scored a 1 for that criminal actor type. By contrast, for state-embedded actors, we can see a cluster of countries with higher scores ranging from a 6 to a 9 out of 10. So in terms of resilience, what we most often saw was two main patterns emerge. First, while many countries had the necessary frameworks in place, showing an expressed desire to combat organized crime, unfortunately, implementation was lacking. And second, often countries' approaches to organized crime were imbalanced. So for example, resilience indicators like international cooperation, national policies and laws regularly scored the highest among the 12 resilience building blocks, with global scores of 5.68 and 5.42 respectively. By contrast, economic and social resilience indicators scored significantly lower on average. Fortunately though, non-state actors, so this would include civil society and the media, did score comparatively high across the 12 building blocks. But again, on the other end of that spectrum, the indicator for government transparency and accountability represented the second lowest average across all 12 resilience building blocks. All right, so taking a step back and in looking at the results overall, we can begin to pull out some interesting relationships between the different indicators. So for example, I mentioned that state-embedded actors were the most dominant actor facilitating organized crime worldwide. And this is particularly troubling because what it tells us is that in many cases, the very apparatus that is meant to be the driving force to counter organized crime may actually be a hindrance or even perpetuate criminal activities. And so the implications of this, of course, not only affect countries' criminality, but also their resilience. And so you see here on this slide, we have a negative correlation, negative 0.47, showing that countries with higher state-embedded actor scores tend to have lower resilience levels. Another key finding of the index looks at the relationship between governance and resilience. So the results show that countries categorized as full democracies on average exhibited higher levels of resilience than authoritarian states, with a strong correlation of 0.79 between the EIU's 2020 Democracy Index and the Global Index Resilience scores. In fact, 4 out of the top 5 countries with the highest resilience were also in the top 10 countries of the 2020 Democracy Index. At the same time, the other end of that spectrum, the majority of countries with the 20 lowest resilience scores were categorized as authoritarian states. And so here we see, that states that are participatory, they're accountable, that are founded in the rule of law, really have a foundation to build state and non-state frameworks that can counter organized crime. While in some of the authoritarian contexts, organized crime as a state function might actually leave little room for other criminal groups to operate. Or in some cases, a state might actually franchise out its monopoly over resources or criminal market to other criminal groups who might act on its behalf. Another factor, such as conflict and instability, was not only linked to criminality, where the highest scoring countries were those experiencing some form of conflict or fragility, but also to resilience, where a strong negative correlation was found at negative 0.87 between the Fragile States Index and the Organized Crime Index resilience scores. So we see that in conflict settings, state attentions are diverted to war efforts, which inevitably leave social, economic, and security institutions weakened. We also see in conflict settings that when there's a dispute over territory or resources, territorial control and social cohesion are likely to be diminished. And so all of these circumstances can lead to an overall decline in the resilience to organized crime. All right, so now I'll just quickly wrap up with some key takeaways and the steps forward. So from the 2021 index results, a few key takeaways became very clear. First, as a first step in dealing with organized crime, the index shows that the scale of the problem must be acknowledged before it can effectively be addressed. The message here is that rich and stable countries are not immune from criminality, and that organized crime is truly a transnational phenomenon. Another key point here is that, as state-embedded actors have been found to play a prominent role in facilitating organized crime globally, working to end their impunity will enhance resilience. Similarly, working to bolster democracy, especially in those fragile states, is important and useful in tackling organized crime. And then finally, working towards peace is crucial to reduce those opportunities that criminality takes advantage of to thrive. All right, now, very quickly, now following the 2021 index and then moving forward, I just wanted to briefly outline where we're headed. So the index will be published every 2 years, and we're currently working on the second iteration, as Ugi mentioned, set to be published in September 2023, covering the year 2022, and with an extended scope to cover an additional 5 criminal markets and 1 more criminal actor type, which you can see there on the left. And these include private sector actors, extortion and protection racketeering, counterfeit goods, illicit trade of excise consumer goods, cybercrime, and financial crimes. And so we're hoping with this expansion that the index will truly be able to reflect real-world conditions, capture criminality in countries that may not necessarily have experienced pervasive levels of the original 10 markets, and then, of course, from a methodological standpoint, limit the need to regularly expand the tool and then risk comparability issues. And so we're currently in our research phase that's due to end in July. Then we will be continuing to periodically update the country profiles throughout the year to capture 2022 in its entirety, and then start our expert rounds that will last through the middle of next year before publishing in September. And so we're really looking forward to having this new edition of the tool that will hopefully capture the evolution of criminality and resilience, particularly with regards to some of the longer-term effects of COVID-19. And so with that, I'll stop here. I know I've gone a little over time.
Laura, thank you very much. A little bit of a time, but it's not a problem. It was super interesting and detailed. So this is fantastic work. I can only be jealous and also admire the number of the number of issues that you must have had to deal with, and you brilliantly solved. But this I will leave it for my question later. So I want to thank you again for this. I would now pass the floor to Pim Gergoed, who is going to give us a couple of reflections, and then we're going to open up for questions. If you have questions in the audience, please feel free to use the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and then I will give you the floor later. Pim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, and thank you both for these presentations. And I can only agree, this is an impressive amount of work and truly an excellent analytical framework that also gives us very useful takeaways for policy. So that's, I mean, the sheer size and insights this offers are enormous. I just want to make 3 short comments, and because we also want to take some time for Q&A. One, picking up from Ugi's suggestion on illicit trade, and I see that as a new category on illicit trade of excise goods, and whether you could include that in the index. I probably already know that the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade published in 2018 an index on the Global Illicit Trade Environment Index together with EIU. It's a bit outdated, and it only covered 84 countries. back then. So it was limited in scope, whereas your index covers, well, most of the world. So that's something that you could pick up on. Perhaps there's some institutional resources out there that could be added, or something to pick up. It's difficult because these markets are very sometimes small, sometimes large, really different to pack together in one form of criminality. Second comment, looking at the report, I was looking at the definition of organized crime that you used for this research, and it closely matches the UNTOC Convention's concepts of what organized crime is. One striking difference, I believe, that's present in the definition of organized crime is that there's a lack of mentioning of serious offenses. There's not a seriousness dimension in the definition of organized crime that you use in the report, whereas that is present in the definition of an organized crime group in the UNTOC Convention. In practice, I don't think it makes any difference because the offenses that you cover are serious offenses, but somehow for the conceptualization of what organized crime is, it just struck me that there's not a seriousness element in the definition of organized crime in the way you use it. So that's a matter of presentation, perhaps, not really any effect on how to operationalize that concept. My third comment is on the resilience and the building blocks. I think that's it's a huge list of things that you can do right and wrong in a country. One thing that I was missing is asset recovery frameworks being present and the effectiveness of those. There is mentioning of that in the report. Perhaps it is included somewhere in those resilience building blocks. I don't know. It's just not very clearly out there. At least I didn't see it. And of course, we all know that asset recovery can play a huge role in having a resilient society that's able to fight organized crime. Somehow that could be included. It's always difficult to measure, of course, whether or not asset recovery is effective in any way whatsoever. I just want to leave it at that because we leave a couple of minutes for a Q&A. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. This was very useful. We have a few minutes for discussion. As a rule of thumb, what we do normally, we stop the recording before the Q&A. So I want to thank, so for the closing of the video, to thank for the presentations, and now we can stop the recording.